us as we go. Um, as you know, we lined up the first quarter of the year with a line of guest speakers from the industry. Today, I'm pleased and honored to have Greg Offsay in our call. Greg is a LA native whose passion for the city is at the core of his approach to the real estate business. Greg joined illi Commercial. You probably see all the signs all over town. Back in December 2007, that was a busy year. After graduating at the University of Southern California, that's where he earned his bachelor's in economics. Greg's primarily focus in brokerage is leasing and investment sales of retail and industrial properties. He works with landlords, tenants, sellers, and buyers to ensure that they achieve their investment and or utility objectives. Greg has also facilitated over 300 transactions with national, international, and local businesses. You probably know most of them, if not all of them, like Westfield, Dunkin' Donuts, Hertz Rent-A-Car, Top Out Fitness, State Bank of India, Dollar Tree, Baskin Robbins, Yogurtland, Menchie's, and more and more and more and more. Greg Offsay, good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be with you guys.
Likewise. I tried a few transactions here and there, but I hope that the intro was proper.
It was perfect. Thank you very much. And those are just a few select transactions and tenants and landlords that I've worked with. And looking at the names here, I've worked with some of the agents on this call and many of the agents in many's offices and all over the greater LA and Southern California region. Some people ask me, why are you giving a talk to Keller Williams agents? Why would you share with them the information that you hold near and dear to your heart, and aren't they your competition? And I always tell people that, while we may compete a little bit here and there on listings, it's more about camaraderie, and we all work together to try to make deals. And the information is not top secret. It's about knowing how to properly serve our clients and be good advisors to our clients. And I think that we all do better when we're all educated. And so I'm happy to be here to help share some of my knowledge and some of my, the things that I look at when doing leasing transactions. And I know that for the most part, it's not what many of the Keller Williams agents focus on. So happy to be a resource and offer my input. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and Greg, you're a true mensch, that's for sure. And also proper shout out to 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐿. He's in a meeting still, so hopefully we'll close the deal and jump back and to hang out with us. But thanks 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐿 for the introduction. As Greg mentioned, it's all about the camaraderie and really just to build those relationships, because if I had to guess, there's more business we can handle by ourselves anyways. So it's okay. It is a competitive arena. At the same time, once again, it all comes down to relationship. And also, Greg, is, if you're on the other side, in most cases, as the landlord rep or what have you, or you have the inventory, we want to know who Greg Offsay is, and we want to know more about illi, and we want to know more about how you run your play, and that's going to help other people to be more professional. So it's a win-win.
Absolutely. And like I said, we work with brokers across all companies. We have 25 agents in-house with our company as well. So I'm doing deals with my coworkers. I'm doing deals with KW agents, with CBRE, JLL, you name it. It's all about cooperation and trying to work together. So you want me to get started? Do you want to open it up to your agents to
Yeah, no, go for it. I mean, I made it with a co-host. You can share screen and take over and present whatever you want to present and share with us and take the lead. And as you guys, whoever is watching us, as you have questions, feel free to ask. It's a dialogue more than like just Greg talking. And let's take it from there, Greg. All yours.
Sure. Okay. So before I share a screen, yeah. So as many mentioned, Michael 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐜𝐡 is a longtime friend and colleague. We've traded referrals numerous times. He's primarily focused in the multifamily investment sales world. He does not cross over into retail, commercial, certainly not on the leasing side. And so whenever he has needs in that space, whether it's leasing, property management, he's always reached out and we've always worked together, and it's been a great a camaraderie and complement to each other's business. So I do thank Michael for introducing me to many and for inviting me to be a guest speaker in your meeting here and to talk to you about commercial leasing. So I'm going to share a screen. I put together a little deck to show you guys what we do here at illi and a little bit about the ins and outs of commercial leasing. So give me 1 second here. Let me make sure I've got the right thing up. Can you all see commercial leasing?
Yeah, can see it. Yeah.
All right. So we'll start with the very basics. What's a lease? A lease is a contract that conveys one party's right to use another party's property. In real estate, that means that you're giving up possession of your real estate to allow somebody to rent and occupy that space. It's for a specified amount of time, which we call the term of the lease. And it's in exchange for consideration, which is normally a periodic, usually monthly payment of rent. The parties involved are the lessor, often referred to more commonly as the landlord, the lessee, often referred to more commonly as the tenant. One thing that most agents don't realize and often try to negotiate terms into the lease that affect the agents are not parties to the lease. While there are some clauses in standard leases that do address the role of brokers and agents, indemnification and other clauses, we are not actually parties to the lease. We don't sign the lease. We don't have obligations to perform under the lease. We're just advisors to our clients through that transaction. A few of the key components of the lease: security deposit is a monetary consideration that's provided by the tenant, by the lessee to the lessor, to be held by the lessor as security for the lessee's improvement over the term of the lease. So if the tenant defaults, if there's damage to the property at the end of the term, the landlord is able to utilize this money. They have something that they're actually holding on to that they can utilize to repair the property, to cure a default if tenant doesn't pay rent. Otherwise, if everything goes smoothly throughout the term, the lease expires and the tenant vacates, then that money is refundable, similar to a residential lease or otherwise. Base rent is what most people would consider just to be rent. It's the actual income that the landlord derives from the lease. It's the money that is paid to the landlord as consideration for the cost of the lease. In addition to base rent, tenants are often required to pay their share of common area operating expenses. That's a reimbursement to the landlord of the actual expenses that the landlord pays to operate the property. Those include property taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance, which engulfs a whole number of things: property management fees, utilities, landscaping, parking lot maintenance, plumbing issues, roof issues, you name it. Common area operating expenses is sometimes abbreviated as CAOE, just to be short, or more traditionally, triple net, NNN. So if you hear of a triple net lease, that is a lease that separates out the tenant's portion of common area operating expenses from the base rent. So here's a little matrix here of a few different types of leases that one might sign. A gross lease, often referred to as a full service gross lease, is very common in traditional office leasing. If you're going to rent office space in a high-rise building or a Class A building, you'll most likely sign a full service gross lease. This type of lease incorporates the common area operating expenses and your base rent all together into one payment to the owner. You have one payment. Unfortunately, with the AIR forms, which are common in commercial brokerage, the AIR form, their gross lease does not set forth what would be traditionally perceived as a gross lease. The AIR form actually has base rent plus the lessee's share of common area operating expenses. The difference between the AIR's gross lease and the AIR's triple net lease in terms of charging the share of common area operating expenses as an additional cost to the base rent, the triple net lease or the net lease allows a landlord to charge each tenant their pro rata share of all of the expenses: common area maintenance, property taxes, and property insurance. The gross lease, they can charge the actual amount of the common area maintenance charges, but instead of charging the actual amount of property tax and property insurance, you charge what is considered to be the increase in those amounts above what the cost was in the base year of the lease. So for example, if you signed a lease this year and the taxes were $10,000, and next year the taxes are $11,000, in a triple net lease, the landlord can charge you your proportionate share of $11,000 next year. In a gross lease, the landlord can only charge you the increase above the base year, so they can only charge you your share of the $1,000 increase above the base year. So in all leases, there's negotiation. And when you're negotiating a lease, there's often give and take between landlord and tenant, and the tenants always want to get as much from the landlord as they can, and the landlords always want to, within reason, offer a little bit, but not too much. So one of the key things that tenants usually ask the landlords for is a tenant improvement allowance, sometimes referred to as TI, TIA, or TA. Some of the big landlords just call it a tenant allowance. This is money that the landlord gives to a tenant to reimburse them for their actual out-of-pocket expenses to build out a space. Usually it's a reimbursement. If you're smart and you represent the landlord, it's a reimbursement after the tenant has already paid out their money, provided the landlord with copies of paid construction invoices, lien releases from contractors, and they've opened their business. If you want to get aggressive and you're representing the tenant, you may push to ask the landlord to write you a check right on lease signing. Not a savvy move for a landlord to do that, because sometimes you write that check and the tenant doesn't finish their build out and they've skipped out with your money. TIs are often reserved for bigger deals, creditworthy tenants, landlords who have deeper pockets and budgets to accommodate that, not necessarily mom and pop tenants and mom and pop owners. Usually it would be on the mom and pop smaller retail deals or smaller office deals, you'll likely get free rent in some fashion in lieu of a tenant improvement allowance. Sometimes you'll get both. As far as free rent goes, there are a few ways that you can structure free rent. You can do it as a delayed commencement of rent, where you have a gap between, excuse me, the lease commencement date and the rent commencement date. If you set it up this way, where the lease starts in January and the rent starts in April, and you've gotten January and February and March for free, that rent was never due, and that rent can never be collected again. It was actually not due. If you do, the next option is early possession. Say you wanted to give somebody access to the premises, but you didn't want to have the lease start right away, you can set up early possession where the lease won't start until April, but from the moment the lease is signed and they give you the proper insurance and the money, you can give the tenant possession of the premises. Under this section of the lease, of the AIR lease, the tenant's obligations to pay rent don't start, but they are obligated once they take possession to start paying their share of common area operating expenses. If you want to have it fully free, you'd have to strike that clause. Early possession enforces all of the terms of the lease. The tenant is liable for everything under the lease except for the obligation to pay rent. The third and more common form of free rent is rent abatement, which means that the landlord just forgives rent for a period of time under which it's due. So to set this up, you'd have the rent and the lease start on the same day. So in the same example, your lease starts January 1st. Your rent commencement date is technically January 1st, but you add a clause into an addendum that says, you know, landlord shall abate the rent for January, February, and March of 2021. That means that the rents, as an inducement to the tenant, you're giving them this free rent period. But when you do it that way, and it's technically per the lease, the rent had commenced on January 1st, but you have waived the rent for those 3 months. If the tenant ever defaults on the lease, there's a clause in the lease that discusses what's called an inducement recapture, giving them this free rent and waiving the rent for a period that it was supposed to be due is considered an inducement into the lease. It's a concession that the landlord provides, a material concession to get the tenant to sign the lease. But if they ever default on the lease and you have to go through an unlawful detainer or you're trying to settle it out, you're able to recapture those inducements. So setting it up as a rent abatement in practice gives the tenant the free rent, but it also protects the landlord on the back end that you can add that back in if you ever were to seek a judgment or an unlawful detainer. As far as free rent goes and TI allowance goes, it's usually a function of how much a tenant's going to invest in your property. Landlords aren't just going to say, you know, for this deal, I'll give you 6 months free and $50,000 no matter what you're doing. You want to see what the budget is for the tenant who's coming in, how much money they're going to spend. Do they need to permit their work? Are they going to, is it going to take them 6 months to build out and get up and running? Is it going to take them a month? You don't want to give too much. You want to make sure that the tenant has something of their own invested in your property as well. So we always look at the economics of the deal, the proposed construction budget, the plans, from the landlord side before we're willing to offer these concessions. Then in addition to that, you want to look at the tenant's financials, their credit worthiness, their credit history, their rental history. If it's an established business, you may want to get references from other landlords that they've leased from. Just like giving anybody a loan or borrowing, you're essentially taking out a loan from the landlord when you get free rent, and especially when you get actual cash from the landlord as a tenant improvement allowance. As far as rent adjustments go in a lease, when you're negotiating a lease, almost every landlord on a multi-year lease is going to want the rent to increase over the course of that term. Oftentimes it's annual, and there are a few different ways that it can increase. In the AIR lease, the rent adjustment and the option addendum spell out 3 different forms of rent adjustments. Cost of living adjustments, you may have heard of the Consumer Price Index, CPI. It's essentially a measure of inflation in our economy. Historically, over 100 years, it's about 4%. In the last 10 years, it's really fluctuated a lot. There have been points where it's been less than 1% and points where it's been 3-4% again. A lot of people are projecting inflation out in the not too distant future. So most of the newer leases that we're seeing, people are trying to put in CPI benchmark adjustments so that you're not losing out to the market if you're adjusting another way. Tenants don't always like it because they can't budget for it. You don't know exactly what the CPI will be year in and year out. And so it's hard to put together a 5 or 10 year projection if your increases are based exclusively on CPI. So sometimes you'll put in a CPI and you'll put in a minimum. If you're the landlord's rep, there'll be a CPI with a minimum 3% increase. And then if you represent the tenant, if that happens, you'll likely want to put a cap on that CPI, just like the landlord wanted to put a minimum. So then your CPI will be bounded by a minimum and a maximum. Not as common during the base term of the lease or within any term, but oftentimes entering an option period, you'll have a market rental value adjustment, which you take a survey of similar properties in the area and determine what the market rents are, and you'll adjust the rent to the market rate on a per foot basis, or some other measure that you can translate from one property to another. Generally, it's price per square foot, and you will apply that rate to your property. The market rental value adjustment in the AIR form uses what's called a baseball arbitration. It starts out with each side putting forth what they believe the market rent to be. Hopefully you agree on it and you're able to just establish a new rate and you move forward. If you can't, it goes to this baseball arbitration, which is just a way to arbitrate. Each side hires a third-party consultant. There's an option for either a local broker or an appraiser who's familiar with the market. Once each side has hired their consultant, those 2 consultants hire a third consultant, and it's up to those 3 consultants to survey the market and determine what the market value is. That number is not what becomes the new rent. Baseball arbitration is a way to arbitrate where it makes the opposing parties negotiate in good faith by not being too aggressive with their initial numbers. So what happens is the party that prevails is the party whose number is closest to the market value, and that party who prevails, their original number is what becomes the new rent. So if you're the tenant and you come in and say that the rent should be $2 a square foot, and the landlord says the rent should be $3 a square foot, and the arbitrators say the market rent is $2.55 per square foot, the landlord's $3 number wins. So it's whoever's closest to the market value. It's not the actual market value that the consultants come up with. So you got to be very careful when you're coming up with those numbers, and you got to do some real strategizing and research going into it. Again, that's usually in an option renewal. That's not so much on an annual rent adjustment basis, because it is complex and, you know, it varies tremendously. The third and likely most common adjustment is fixed increases. Typically a fixed percentage, 3, 4, 5, 10%, whatever it may be. And that could be annually, that could be every 5 years, that could be every 2 years, whatever you negotiate between the parties. Some of my clients, rather than doing a percentage, like to do an amount per square foot. So I have one client who never does it based on a percentage. He just does 5 or 10 cents per square foot every year on all of his deals. That's what he prefers, and it's whatever metric you want to come up with and you can get both parties to agree to. Tenants like it this way because they can budget and they can forecast going through however long the lease term is, and they know exactly what their rents will be for that whole term because it's fixed. If you do it based on cost of living or based on market value, then you have some variables that you have to figure out. The various options that tenants can take on in a lease. The most common is the option to extend the lease. Usually when you're negotiating a lease, you sign, say, a 5-year lease, and you want the option to extend if business is going well. You want to be able to know that you'll be there for another 5 or 10 or 15 years after. So often landlords will grant tenants an option to extend. No matter what the options are, tenant has to be in good standing on the lease in order to exercise the option. So whether that's an option to extend, less common would be an option to purchase. Sometimes tenants want to start out renting a building and then move to owning the building in the future, and they may try to negotiate for the option to purchase. If I represent a landlord, I would never allow a landlord to give an option to purchase. As an alternative, you might include what we'd call a first right of refusal or right of first refusal, which is slightly different from an option in that you're agreeing to allow the tenant to have the ability to match an offer that you receive, or if you're going to put the property on the market, you would be obligated as the owner to approach the tenant first before you took other offers, but you're not giving them the option to choose on their own to purchase your property at a predetermined value. So it gives the tenant a little bit of control, and it might inhibit your ability to sell it in the future, but not nearly as much as if somebody had the outright universal option. Options are always for the benefit of the tenant in this regard, because it's the tenant's option. They control it, they get to make the decision, and it's in their discretion. As long as they're not in default of the lease at the time that they're supposed to exercise, it's their right. So as a landlord rep, which is primarily what I am, I really try to limit options. If we're negotiating a lease, it's a 5-year deal, I'll usually try to give only one 5-year option. We usually try to match the option to the base term. Depending on the tenant and their qualifications, sometimes we'll give 2 options of like term, but I'll always try to get market adjustments entering those options. Another thing that a lot of tenants are always considering when they come into leases is, what about an assignment or a sublease? What if my business does really well and I want to sell it? Or what if it does really poorly and I need to get out of my lease before the end of the term? Assignment and subleasing is, each one is an option that a tenant can try to exercise to transfer their lease to another party. An assignment is the transfer of the entire premises for the entire remaining term. And you're transferring that term and you're transferring the tenancy and the rights to the lease to the assignee. One common misconception is that it automatically wipes out the original tenant's responsibilities under the lease. That's not the case. Most leases, including the AIR lease, still maintain the original tenant, the original lessee, as an additional guarantor, if you will, after the assignment has been transacted. So the assignee will assume first position and will become essentially the tenant under the lease, but the original lessee will still be responsible under that term of the lease, unless you amend it in the assignment. A sublease is when you transfer usually a portion of the space, but sometimes it's all of the space, for not necessarily the whole term. The sublessor is the original tenant, the original lessee. They remain essentially in first position for liability purposes with the landlord, and they're responsible to collect the rent from the subtenant and deliver it to the landlord. The landlord can take rent directly from a subtenant if you negotiate that and arrange for that. But in a sublease, the original tenant sort of remains the middle person in that transaction. Couple things to note regarding options and assignments. Well, we'll get there in a second. With assignments and subletting, the number one thing that holds tenants up and trips them up and gets them into trouble is doing it without the landlord's consent. You have to get the landlord's consent to transfer the lease under most circumstances. There are some, non-arm's length transactions. If it's a company that takes on an investor, that could be considered a transfer that you may not need to get the landlord's consent for. But you always want to get the landlord's consent. If you don't get the landlord's consent and you transfer the lease to a third party, the AIR lease specifically says that the tenant's in default and at the landlord's choosing, they can put them in default or they can put them in a non-curable breach, which is even worse than a default from the standpoint of it gives the landlord the right to possibly terminate the lease and take back possession. I'm actually in a transaction right now where a tenant transferred the lease without consenting the owner. The owner would not have consented to the transfer, and now they are terminating the lease, and we're trying to bring in a new tenant there. So it happens, and it could be really detrimental, especially if you're trying to do it as part of a business sale. If you're trying to sell your business and transfer your lease, and you make your transaction on the business, and you just bring somebody in and they start taking over for you, if the landlord's not happy about it, they could really come back and mess with that transaction and terminate the lease. So be careful with that. There are fees that tenants have to pay in order to get consent. There's a $500 fee that's outlined in the AIR lease. That's just a standard consideration fee, just simply for the landlord to even review an application from a new tenant. But in that clause, in that section, it also references the paragraph where it discusses the fact that tenants are required to pay any reasonable costs incurred by the landlord when a tenant requests consent. So in this case, if they're requesting consent for an assignment or subletting, other cases may be consent to do improvements to the property. Sometimes the landlords need to hire a consultant. It might be an attorney, it might be a contractor or an architect, and they're going to incur costs. The landlord has the right per the lease to charge that tenant back for those costs. So when you're advising a tenant on an assignment or subletting, you want to make sure that you address this ahead of time with the landlord and determine who they're going to get involved, what the potential costs are, maybe try to limit them because they could be pretty high and without limitation if you don't address that up front. As I started to mention earlier, with an assignment and subletting, it's not a guarantee that when you assign your lease, if you have options remaining, that those options will transfer. In fact, the standard language in the lease in 3 different sections indicates that the options are personal to the original lessee. So they absolutely would not transfer in an assignment or a subletting unless you amend this lease or you specifically negotiate it in that transfer. It's a key component, especially if you're trying to sell a business and you think that you've got 2 years left on your first 5-year term, but you have 2 5-year options and you're advertising a business with 12 years remaining left on your lease because you have those 2 5-year options. Unless you've negotiated with your landlord or you know that the landlord will allow the options to transfer, if you just go by the letter of the lease without making any changes, those options do not transfer, and that could jeopardize a business sale or an assignment of a lease if the new party is expecting to get those options. So these were just some of the tips that we use in negotiating leases and some of the clauses. As I always talk to my team about, and I remind myself about it, as agents, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients. We are licensed by the state. We're held to a higher standard of knowledge in our field than the general public is. And, aside from just the liability and the responsibility, we have a desire to serve our clients. The real estate brokerage business is about transacting deals, but it's mainly about relationships and growing those relationships so that we can transact deals with those clients for long term. You definitely want to make sure you can properly serve your client. And leasing, although it seems sometimes like it's pretty simple and straightforward. It can be complex and it can be challenging. And if you're not well equipped and you don't know what you're doing, you can get yourself and you can get your clients in a lot of trouble. And so it's always best to know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and work with partners, whether that's within KW, whether that's myself or my team at illi Commercial or another third party. There are ways that you can serve your clients to make sure that they're properly taken care of, that yeah, you may have to give up a few commission dollars to refer a client or to co-broker with another partner, but at the end of the day, your client's gonna see that selfless act and appreciate it and respect it for taking care of them. And it's gonna come back around to you tenfold in the future for the relationship. As I mentioned earlier, Michael refers me or brings me in to consult with his clients whenever they have retail needs. I do the same if I have any multifamily questions. I know what I know what I don't know, and sometimes knowing what you don't know is one of the biggest strengths in this business. At illi Commercial, we specialize, as many mentioned earlier, in commercial brokerage and property management, retail, office, and industrial. That's our bread and butter. We do property management, we do brokerage, we lease, we sell. We have a long track record doing it. Todd Nathanson, the owner of our company, has been doing it for 35 plus years. I've been with him, as many mentioned, for 13 years, since 2007. We have 25 agents with varying degrees of experience and expertise in various aspects of the industry. We're always happy to pay a referral fee, to partner with another agent on a transaction. At the end of the day, it's about serving our clients and growing a great community for all of us. And that's one of my passions, is helping people open their businesses and seeing the growth in the community through the work that we do. One of the deals that I did last year during the pandemic, I know many has offices all over LA. Some of you are based in Calabasas or the West Valley. One of the deals I did last year was put in a new pizza place in Tarzana. Woodland Hills at Topanga and 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐡. They actually just opened today, so go check them out. Tomato pie pizza joint next to the Starbucks at Topanga and 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐡. That was a referral through an outside broker who wasn't able to advise the clients for the listing on that property. I've been serving that property now for 7 years, and every time I do a transaction, that agent gets a referral fee. So, it's all about relationship building. I know another KW agent, I don't know if he's on the call or not, but in these offices, David Yashar is a great friend of illi. Todd and David go way, way back. They do a lot of business together, both co-brokering and referring. We're an open book. I'm here to help. I'm here to offer insight and help serve your clients, help serve you guys, and grow our business and our community moving forward. So,
Greg, but by the way, we have Omid Saleh that works with David's.
Yeah, I don't like Omid. I want to talk to David. Hi, Omid.
Greg, first of all, thank you. That was brilliant, smooth, to the point presentation. We have a great group of professionals on the call. So once again, appreciate the attitude. I told you at the beginning, you mentioned two professionals, so much appreciated. 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐡, thanks again for the introduction. let's open up for questions or comments, whatever you guys wanna ask Greg, wanna share. Take advantage. Now is the time. I'm looking at the questions, if at the chat, if there's anything over here.
Michael looks distraught.
Yeah, I was gonna point Michael out. He's probably on I think he's on the phone. Omid, are you still there? Oh, he just dropped from the call.
Anybody have any interesting tenants looking in the area? Any deals we can put together right now? Any needs?
Go ahead, Michael. Michael, can you hear us?
Maybe. Do you want me to hear you?
No, we just thank you earlier about the introduction with Greg.
Thank you.
What's up, Money?
How you doing?
I'm good, bro. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Look at you growing out I love it, bro. You groomed that thing?
Every day.
Yo, thanks for coming on board. We're gonna keep on. I wanted to introduce you to the commercial team. We got some good players over here. You know, between Ron Feder, Joe Fenish, we got Jason on the line. You know, we got some hitters up here, and I think you're definitely an important person to know in Los Angeles. And for anybody that doesn't know who this man is on Zoom, this is probably the largest in regards to retail and leasing. It's probably the largest listing broker in San Fernando Valley, and I would say LA County, not with a major institutional group. The largest retail leasing broker in LA is on this Zoom call, people. Just FYI. Real talk. There's not a block you can drive in LA without seeing one of his signs on there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's not just me. Like I said, we've got a large team. Todd and I definitely push that team to grow and help manage our growth and our production. But we are everywhere. We appreciate your support and your team's support here at KW and elsewhere around town. We love partnering and we love serving mutual clients.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and Greg, if you don't mind to drop your contact info in case someone want to reach out to you directly, email, etc. Jason.
Hey Greg, Jason Fall. Thanks for the presentation today. Question I have is I've got barring a few of my clients, restaurant, real property here, and obviously they're going to be looking for people to share in their own dream in their space. And we've acquired, we're probably in negotiations for 6 or 7 of them. One, do you take your fine skills to the Orange County? And then 2, would you co-broker and help me represent the new ownership and negotiation of lease opportunities that come their way? Because we're going to talk about 6 or 7 restaurants that are going to be looking for new ownership for the business side and representing the landlord. And I know I've done it a couple times, but it seems like this was the way to go. Is it something you would entertain?
Absolutely. We do have listings in Orange County. I don't do a ton of business down there on the listing side. I've done more tenant rep work in Orange County. I have some agents who specialize in going further south in the greater LA area. But we're familiar with it. Southern California is our backyard. Restaurants and bars are a particular passion of mine, not only because I like to eat and drink, but I've found I really enjoy the deal making side of it. I've sold businesses, I've sold business assets, I've sold real estate, I've done a lot of lease transactions, large and small, quick service to 10,000 square feet. So definitely happy to speak with you and learn more about the opportunity, and appreciate you thinking of me.
Yeah, I'll reach out and see if we can make sense to take a lot off my plate. That's for sure.
Cool. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jason,
Greg.
I was just gonna say that Greg's a legend.
Well, it's good to know,
Second is
Mike, because
what?
I would hate to think you're bringing the kind of talent to this call that would be a waste of our time.
Yo, I drive around town. There isn't a place, you know, that I don't see this guy's sign. There isn't a shopping center I don't think I've driven by in years where I don't see one of his and Todd's signs like somewhere there. It's all over the place. So I trust Greg. I sent him as many people that asked me